So, global gateway partnerships, and it is going to be a very, very interesting final panel, and I do encourage anybody who is close to the door to move the other way and come back into their seats, because to set the scene, I want to introduce Marek Mora, who is Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear panelists, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure for me to introduce the panel on global gateway partnerships, the final panel of this, we can already say that, very successful and stimulating forum. Let me warmly welcome our panelists. I would like to sincerely thank you for your availability and readiness to share your perspectives on how we can work better to deliver on common development goals. We have a very diverse panel today, and I'm very grateful for it. Each and every one of you will probably have your own take on how to create long-term partnerships supporting development ambitions. The task is, of course, not easy. The geopolitical landscape is undergoing a profound transformation. We don't have to speak the two wars, one directly in our neighborhood, the other one in the Middle East. Power balances are shifting, supply chains are being reconfigured. But we are of a firm view that cooperation must replace dependency and rivalry, must give way to partnerships. The central theme of our panel is Global Gateway. This is one of Europe's answers to global upheavals. It is its positive offer to the world, a value-based strategy grounded in transparency, sustainability, and mutual benefit. As a financing arm of the European Union, the EIB plays a central role in turning this €300 billion EU strategy into reality. We have already invested more than €25 billion in global gateway priority sectors, sustainable energy, transport, social infrastructure, digital, health and education, and mobilised over €125 billion across the globe from public and private investors on the back of the EU contribution. Our contribution, the EIB contribution, is threefold. First, we provide scale. The global investment gap, particularly in climate, connectivity and social infrastructure, is measured in trillions, not billions. I do not speak about Czech koruna, I don't speak about Italian lira, I mean US dollar and euro, trillions euro. Through our lending capacity, blending instruments and ability to mobilise private capital, the EIB brings financial firepower that makes transformational projects possible. Second, we provide standards. In a world where financing can sometimes come with hidden costs, Europe offers transparency, environmental responsibility, and respect for local communities. Our projects are aligned with the Paris Agreement, uphold high social and governance standards, and are designed to be financially sustainable over the long term. Third, we foster partnerships. Global Gateway aims to create solutions to development challenges with partner countries, but based on their priorities and development strategies. Whether in the EU's neighbourhood, in Africa, in Latin America or Asia, our objective is clear: to support local value creation, skills development, economic resilience, and the establishment of sustainable value chains mutually beneficial for the EU and its partners. Global Gateway embodies this win-win philosophy. For our partner countries, it means modernized infrastructure, better access to clean energy, digital connectivity, and improved public services. It means jobs, innovation, and stronger integration into the global economy. For Europe, it means deeper economic ties, more resilient supply chains, and new markets and opportunities for European companies. Firms that bring world-class expertise in renewable energy, transport system, water management, digital technologies and healthcare infrastructure. You heard yesterday from our President in detail about the EIB Group's extensive activities and ambitions outside the EU. Our message, her message, was clear. While some are pulling back, Europe is stepping up. I am looking forward to hearing your views. Once again, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much. And now to welcome onto the panel, please, your moderator, it's San Bilal, who is the Director of the European Centre for Development Policy Management, the ECDPM. And joining him on stage, we have Jessika Roswall, European Commissioner for Environment, Water Resilience and a Competitive Circular Economy, Jorge Moreira da Silva, UN Under-Secretary General and UNOPS Executive Director, Matthieu Muzumdar, Deputy CEO of Meridiam, Hubert Danso, CEO and Chairman of Africa Investor Group, and Prishani, we must say also that Angela Stojanovic couldn't come, Minister of Education from Montenegro, but we were delighted to have Prishani Satyapal, who is the Executive Director of ECHO, Earth, Our Common Home, and Chief Inspiration Officer of Sustainability Truthing.
Good morning. It is really a privilege to be with such a prestigious panel for this final discussion, which is on the Global Gateway. And at ECDPM, we work on external European relations and the dynamics in developing countries. And one of the questions that I get the most often is, what is Global Gateway? And I have these questions from partners of the EU, but also by many European actors. What is Global Gateway, and how does it work in practice? What does it mean concretely? And I think we should be aware. I'm not going to be able to answer this question fully now, because I think otherwise we would have no panel discussion at all. But I just wanted to stress the evolution that we can perhaps see about Global Gateway. Initially, Global Gateway has been a way to brand and package and convey externally activities that, in fact, Europe has been doing already for quite some time on stimulating investment and based on development finance. And, of course, being here at the EIB, this has been work that the EIB has been doing also with other European actors at a large scale for quite some time. So there was indeed an element of rebranding and repackaging. But there was also perhaps two additional dimensions. The first one has been to say that we are not going to talk just about how much we put in the machine, so how much aid is going to be provided for Global Gateway, but the notion was how much we can mobilize in terms of investment. So it was more in terms of the outputs, and I think that was quite interesting. So in fact, we come with these 300 billion euros that were supposed to be mobilized by 2027, already reached now, and a third of it coming from the European Investment Bank, thanks to the efforts. But in fact, instead of communicating for how much each actor has contributed to, it's really the question of the mobilization, which was quite, I think, an interesting dimension. The second one is that EU institutions and was more used to communicate in terms of what is the EU, as EU institutions, EIB and the European Commission under the EU budget are doing. And then came this Team Europe approach. So this notion that it is not just under what we do under the EU budget and with the EU institutions alone, but how the institutions also from each EU member states are contributing, and it's a collective effort that came together. That is, I would say, the initial dimension of Global Gateway. What we have seen in particular stressed by the von der Leyen Commission 2.0, the second one, which was stressing, we want to have an investment commission, but I think it is further stressed also by the turmoil that we're seeing in the world these days. It has been this notion of we need to think much more at the European level what is also our own strategic interest and how can we focus better on what really matters for us, competitiveness, and I was happy to hear also during this forum a lot of discussions of, even when it was not about the EIB global part of the forum, but the connection between what's happening at the domestic level within the EU and the international dimension. The EU cannot operate in a vacuum, and so this connection is really, and Global Gateway is one of the instruments to make this connection between what we do internally and what is done externally. A second dimension, of course, has been this notion of strategic autonomy. And again, strategic autonomy means we cannot work just in autarky, so it also means strategic diversification. And how can we have different partners and how can we work? And finally, what Nadia Calvino, I think, mentioned very nicely in her introductions as well, is this notion of win-win partnerships that I think you were stressing so many times. So this notion that we do have a partnerships and it's a win for the partners. So it is these initial notions that we were talking about, how to mobilize investment for the partners in the notion of development finance, but also this notion that there is something for us. So the question is, how do we articulate that in practice, and what are some of these changes meaning concretely? And I think that's where I will turn to the panel, and I will start with you, Madam Commissioner, on perhaps this notion of partnership, and how do you see this notion of partnership in what you're doing? And I think at the European level we started with this water resilience strategy that has been initiated, and perhaps what is the international dimension of what you're doing, and how do you link that up to the partnership?
No, thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you for talking about Global Gateway. As you say, I also get this question, and as you say, it's a win-win for Europe, and I think it's also linked to how we build a strong Europe. Yes, I have the wrong title, and one of the things that is in my title that finally you may say that Europe, actually EU is putting as a priority is water. And of course water is something that is not only a challenge for Europe, it's something that is really that we need partners. We cannot do that by ourselves. Water is by definition circular, or like we have one water cycle that is broken and we need to focus on that. So we put forward a water resilience strategy last year, which of course focus also on the challenges that we have in Europe, both when it comes to quantity here. Sometimes we have too much, sometimes too little, sometimes at the same time, and that is a challenge, but not only for Europe, of course, but also the quality. So that is one thing that we are doing, but we are working very much with global partners on water. For example, we have structured dialogues with China, with Egypt, and also I've been, wherever I go in the world, I always have discussions on water, whether it's on the UN conference, on the UNGA, whether it's in Malaysia, whether it's in Africa, in different places I've been. I also would say that also in Europe, and that's maybe back to a strong Europe, because I was in Davos last year in the World Economic Forum, I was in the Munich Security Conference this year and last year, and I would say that water is something that connects us all, because that is something that is a threat to us when it comes to security. It's something that is driving migration, driving conflicts and so forth. So for us it's obvious that we need to focus on water. And here the Global Gateway is important. As you mentioned, the figures, almost more than 300 billion euros. Together with the EIB, working we have a lot of flagships all around the world. I'm working, of course, with my colleague Josef Sikela mostly on this. He's out there. But when it comes to water, it's very specific in the Global Gateway. And I think that is obvious for the reasons I said. Also, one thing I want to add here, because we talk a lot about energy, of course, in these days. And here, again, the nexus between water and energy production is something that we build together with partners around the world and building that in a sustainable way. So I have a lot of examples here when it comes to this example, but also sanitation, of course, in Africa, irrigation. I also will say that Europe is learning a lot from our partners when it comes to transboundary cooperation. So it's a lot of things that we are doing but water is one thing that I think join us.
Thank you very much. We'll get back to the nexus and to some of the examples. Perhaps let's stick to how do you see a global gateway, and in particular, since we were talking about partnership, it's difficult to not think about the UN, at least in Europe, where we are very concerned about the multilateralism and the UN institutions. So, Jorge Moreira da Silva, we're very happy to have you here. You're also not only the UN Under-Secretary General, but you're also the Executive Directors of UNOPS. That plays a very important role. Can you perhaps just, for those that would not be familiar, UNOPS is a very important institution, but perhaps not the most known. Tell us what is exactly UNOPS and what is your contributions in the partnerships to Global Gateway?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Nadia Calvino for the kind invitation. And indeed, UNOPS is on the ground. So it's an agency that is focused on implementation. We are non-programmatic, which means that we are demand-driven. We are based on the demand from partner countries, and we work on infrastructure, procurement and project management, with a high concentration in highly fragile conflict and violent contexts. And that's why the Global Gateway makes all sense for us. In addition to what Vice President of the EIB said about the added value of the Global Gateway, about being based on standards, based on collaboration, there is another element that for us it's crucial, which is getting the things done on infrastructure. There is a nexus between infrastructure and the SDGs. According to some research that we have conducted with Oxford University, 92% of the Sustainable Development Goals depend on infrastructure. And 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions are related with infrastructure. So unless we get it right on infrastructure, sustainable and resilient infrastructure, we will miss the SDGs and we'll miss the Paris Agreement. That's why it's so important.
So Europe was right to focus on the Global Gateway on infrastructure, which is sometimes a question we get.
No, I think it's where we need a game changer. We need the game changer to be not on mobilization of finance. As you said, it's about mobilizing, aligning, because mobilization alone won't fix the problem. We need to mobilize and align all finance with SDGs and with climate objectives, and we need to focus on delivery, because I know many contexts where policy reforms have been put in place, where finance has been provided, but at the end of the day, we have issues on implementation. That's why the focus on implementation, overcoming the bottlenecks on implementation is so important, and that's why I think that we have been one of the partners of choice of Global Gateway, partnering with the European Union on infrastructure, particularly in the really difficult context.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Prishani Satyapal, who is, I love your title, you're the Chief Inspiration Officer of Sustainability Truthing. Perhaps a word on your Inspiration Officer would be good, but when we're talking about partnerships, ultimately what matters is what it means for the local populations. Can you tell us how do you see this connection between these broad agendas and what is happening at the local level?
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to the EIB team for this extraordinary opportunity. I want to introduce, in line with the word inspiration, a word that perhaps hasn't been used very much over the last few days, which is the word peace. And when we talk about Global Gateway, when we talk about reaching communities and we talk about enabling the strength of Europe, part of what I do is spend time in communities that we don't often reach. So as much as the infrastructure investments are required in Johannesburg, Accra, Lagos, Cairo, I spend time in communities that we don't even hear about every day, where perhaps the fragility of the world is enabled easier. So part of what we do is I work with perhaps one of the first development agencies, which is the Catholic Church. I'm Hindu, from South Africa, working in Nigeria and Rome, so I feel like sometimes I am my own multilateral agency. But what do I do with the Catholic Church is through universities, hospitals, schools, we enable that first development agency to reach communities and partner with groups, investors, to enable infrastructure, while communities, and this is fundamental, communities are able to hear from the local priest or imam or sister conversation around trust in terms of that infrastructure enablement. So locating the infrastructure within a church property, and from that expanding out into communities, that's a different approach that we're advocating. And also, just in Nigeria alone, like you heard from Cardinal Turkson yesterday, we have 18,000 sites that reach 89 million people. So what we're saying is we want scale, but accelerated scale in places that people already trust.
Good, we'll get back again. I'll have plenty of questions to you about concrete examples, but for this first round, I think it's good that we have a general overview. Let me turn to Matthieu Muzumdar from Meridiam. When we're talking about infrastructure, then you feel at ease there, no? That's one of the core business of what you're trying to do. Can you tell us how Global Gateway is helping, perhaps, or the approach that you are having internationally in trying to develop infrastructure?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. What we do at Meridiam is really we're a mission company and a B Corp, and really our mission is to deliver sustainable infrastructure that can have a positive impact on local communities. In practice, one of the key challenges we have is implementation, is really unlocking the projects. So it's about mobilizing the right financing, but it's also about bringing the right know-how, the right supply chain, the right technical expertise to actually build these assets, make them investable, build them, and then in a way de-risk them from construction, manage them over the long term to ensure that we can actually deliver the kind of impact that these projects are designed to deliver. And so this is where, to do this for projects which, especially very large projects, but not only, but if you're talking about projects of a very large scale, to Vice President Mora's point, to do this and do it in a sustainable way, this is also about making these projects affordable. This is also about ensuring that your project is not just built, but it can be affordable, it can be have the positive economic impact over the long term. And this is where, to do this, you need to align a number of stakeholders, locally, but also internationally. And at the European level, we have a number of tools, agencies, international finance institutions, and know-how that we can put together. And it's this kind of coalition that can really help unlock projects. And in this way, this is where Global Gateway resonates well with our day-to-day job, which is really to align stakeholders to unlock sustainable infrastructure projects.
And could you just tell us, how do you in practice try to align them? I mean, it sounds nice in principle, but I mean, you are a key actor, so what do you do concretely to try to align these engagements of different actors?
Thank you. It's art more than science, I guess. And I can perhaps take an example of a project that we're developing currently in Jordan, which is a water project actually, which is a very critical infrastructure project. It's really the lifeline of the country. If you think of Jordan being one of the most water scarce countries in the world, you need to deliver more water, and so this project is meant to deliver at 40% of the water of the country. So very, very impactful project in turn. To do this, you need a number of building blocks. So you need to build a big desalination power plant. You need to build 400 or 500 kilometers of pipe to bring this water to Amman. And to Commissioner Roswall's point, you also need a lot of energy. So we actually have a 300 megawatt solar plant to actually fuel the whole thing in a sustainable way. This is a very critical project in itself, as you can imagine, but it's making it sustainable and making it efficient is also about the how. And so to your point, coming to your question of how you align stakeholders, first of all, you need to build affordability. That's the key element because, and so this is, I can give you some examples of how we've done that, but a lot of it is around mobilizing blended finance, and we have a lot of tools at the European levels which have been mobilized to do that. And the second one is also to deliver it to very high environmental and social standards. And this is important in a way for all the stakeholders, and this is where you can create a lot of alignment. It is important, of course, for a number of the financial institutions and investors like us who are financing the project. But it's equally important to the government of Jordan and the local population, because with this approach, you're having a very strong stakeholder engagement, making sure you're creating real local benefits environmentally, but also socially, and making sure they're mutual benefits. And it's a real win-win partnership also economically and socially and that you actually, the country benefits from a lot of the impact also economically that you can build with a very, very large project like this.
Thank you. Let me turn to, again, I would have plenty of more questions, but let me turn first to Hubert Danso. You are a key actor in the financial system in Africa, and I would say both as an actor but also as a thinker about how to mobilize investments and with some ideas. So when we're talking about global gateway capacity to mobilize large amount of investment financings, that must resonate well in your ears, no? Or how do you see the role of Global Gateway compared to what you're trying to do or what you're doing in Africa?
Thank you very much. Real question. That's a real question, and I was quite moved by the Vice President's repetitions. Trillions, he said. Real trillions, in the trillions of dollars. And that pool of capital really only resides with what I have been described as the orphan in the development community. I sat on President Macron's new Global Financial Pact Summit Finance and Private Sector Task Force. And within that entire conversation, it was all development financiers opining on how to mobilize the trillions. And then, there were some quite interesting interventions which basically explained that when the MDBs were established, they were the largest pool of finance available for governments. And of course, they therefore played a leading role, for governments. Fast forward to where we are today, we are a 300+ trillion pool of institutional capital relative to a multilateral development bank system pool of less than 3 trillion, but yet we are not playing the proper role, and we're being guided and mobilized in theory by the multilateral development banking system. Now, as that relates to Africa, these tend to be words, because I think we know that the mobilization ratios are just not materializing. We hear from the G20 that the private capital mobilization ratios and delivery for the development system for Africa and emerging markets and developing countries is supposed to be $10 for every $1 of development finance provided. But the reality, according to the G20 and the Capital Adequacy Framework report, is that we receive 20 to 38 cents on the dollar. And I was very enthused yesterday when I heard President Costa talk about in Europe, $1 mobilizes 15 euros, or €1 mobilizes 15 euros. So why in Africa and emerging markets and developing countries do we have to settle for 20 to 38 cents? And what damage is that really doing to development? So I think the Global Gateway has a real opportunity to change that. But I think the opportunity that it's missing, and I've been going around the conference trying to find peers. I'm not finding pension funds. I'm not finding sovereign wealth funds. I'm not finding those institutions in this room. And I really do believe in the Global Gateway. I believe in the sectors. I believe in the focus. And in fact, we have a very different view on Africa as the institutional investment community. We don't see Africa as a development case. We are long-term investors. We are elephants in some respects. We have a long-term view going forward, and we have a long-term view going backwards. And let's not forget that Africa, in past centuries, used to be 14 to 15% of global GDP. So for us as the institutional investment community, we see Africa not as a development story, but as a mean reversion, which means that we can actually reposition the continent as a globally competitive investment destination. And that's really where we see the promise and the opportunity in the Global Gateway. But I would signal one caution. And this is a message that we continue to hear, but I think it falls on deaf ears. If the European Union, the European Investment Bank, the development community are serious about unlocking the true potential of the Global Gateway, and mobilizing and crowding in private institutional capital, that 300 trillion pool, at scale, and creating the hospitable legal and regulatory environment that it can be deployed at speed, we must stop trying to make investment developmental, and we must make development investable. I can speak for hours, but I think that phrase is really the unlock. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Ashani, I saw you shaking your hands in approval. Please.
Thank you. Talking about making development investable. We're starting very simple. We're saying let's replace diesel generation with clean energy. People are spending double in diesel what they could in solar. We all know the statistics. And we could have double-digit returns on investment. However, you'd be reaching communities at scale. The thing we often don't do, to my colleague, is create the ease of implementation. And that's why I left the mining industry to do what I do now. I had a really lovely, comfortable job. But I was frustrated, as you are, in terms of being able to see the translation of investment to people who really need it, and people who we think are poor but are spending more money than any of us relatively on just being able to survive every day. There's no reason why we cannot see those as customers. And what the opportunity for everybody in this room is to understand that those are investments if you have the right partner at scale, which is what you do when you work with institutional investors, institutions on the ground across the continent of Africa. So I am in absolute agreement, but I also think that for people in this room, it's to understand we're talking about a business opportunity, but to really make the gateway a gateway, the translation of investment also needs to include manufacturing. You need to be able to understand fit-for-purpose manufacturing. You need to understand that there's an opportunity to serve those markets across the African continent in agriculture, in water, in healthcare. These are people already spending money. Don't see it as a charity. And like I said, we only focus on double-digit returns.
Let me rebound, and it's open question to all the panels, so all the panelists, so whoever wants to pick it up. But what we hear quite often in this level of discussions is, first, if you want to mobilize at scale and you want to go for big projects, you'll go to more middle-income countries or markets that are better developed. And if you want to reach out to the poorest and the more difficult context, then you're not going to have this high leverage that we're talking about in terms of capital mobilization, but you might have greater impact on the local population. So sometimes we hear about this dichotomy between either we mobilize at scale or we have a greater impact in different levels. And the second comments that we hear quite often from financiers, at least in Europe, is that the problem is not so much to get the finance, but it's to get the good projects to invest in, that there are not enough good projects to try to invest. What is some of your, you want to, this is perhaps one of your roles as well, to provide support. What is your views on that?
One of the big gaps that we face, in addition to the finance gap and the policy gap, is what I mentioned earlier, which is the implementation gap. So if we dig a bit into what are we missing on implementation, so what makes the difference to overcome the bottlenecks, is something that may look a bit boring in these conversations, but look, it's really important, such as project design, project preparation, technical assistance, procurement, project management, localization. So these are the things that can make the difference to go from the billions to the trillions. But then we also need to look into the market failures. If we are discussing concessional finance, development finance, the crowding in of the public and private finance driven by a purpose, I think it's the neediest, not the easiest, that should be the target. And we have market failures, conflict-affected countries. Who in this room would be ready to go to Gaza, to Myanmar, to Afghanistan, to Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia tomorrow to do renewable energy? That's why it's important that we have the enabling context, but also an intent, so a purpose, making sure that the development finance and the Global Gateway also prioritize areas that are market failures. Another market failure, energy grids. We have a case for renewable energy. With carbon pricing, with all the transformation, there is no doubt that renewable energy is the cheapest. But when we look into the grid by definition are state-owned. How can we ask a state in Africa to do the investment on the grid, not incurring in more debt because they are already indebted, not being able to pass the cost to the consumers because they are under poverty? And how can we ask them to penetrate more, get more penetration of renewable energy without a prioritization from all of us in this room about energy grids and about storage? And finally, climate adaptation. We don't have a business case sufficiently strong for adaptation. We have a business case for mitigation. But look, if we don't invest on resilience, nothing will happen on sustainable development.
Madam Commissioner, and I'll get back to you, but Madam Commissioner, we're talking about resilience and the need to, George gave the example of the electrification, but we could take the example of water. It's the same to try to provide the water supply. So how can we help it? And the second element is also quite often there is a notion of sustainability. To do something more sustainable is more costly, and that it is not necessarily affordable. Could you, perhaps also drawing on the European experience, say what is feasible and what is not feasible?
First, maybe, to Hubert, I agree with you that we need, and that what we're trying to do with the Global Gateway is exactly making investments investable and seeing the link between the sustainable investment and a win-win for Team Europe and for Team Africa or whatever. This is the idea when President von der Leyen last night presented it. And of course, we have a lot of projects that is actually bankable, not all of them. That is the main challenge that I hear from people around the world, but also in Europe. The question you ask me is actually one question I get very often in the European context. Can we be both going toward the green transition, clean transition, at the same time being competitive? Because, Europe is focusing on being competitive. Yes, the answer is quite clear. It is possible, and it is shown in the figures. And actually, sometimes I get this, everybody doesn't know that, but I'm coming from Sweden, and people say to me, it's easy for you to say coming from Sweden, you have energy, you have a lot of, it's a welfare country and so forth. But no, the industry in the northern Sweden, north of northern Europe, but also in the whole of Europe, is doing this not because of well, of course, hopefully they're doing it for climate change also, but it is because it is a business case. So the strongest asset that Europe has at the moment is to invest in decarbonization, I would say. And that, of course, is not only due to Europe, but it's also for the globe. But also back to water, building a strong water resilience in Europe is not only important for us, it's important for the globe. And again here, I think when you talk about scale and all this, that is something that we also struggle with. We have the ideas, but we don't build the scale. So here, of course, the globe, the market is also important for European companies when it comes to the water sector.
So if it's difficult for Europe, is it possible even for the local community that you're trying to work with in terms of providing energy? And is this green energy sometimes also, we've heard some elements of Europe is pushing with the Green Deal, forcing Africa to go green, but in fact we first need to have access to energy, whatever kind of access to energy. So, Shani, what would be your approach at this level?
There's nothing about green that people in the developing world do not want. What people in the developing world, emerging markets, places I've lived in and live in need is accessible, affordable, innovative, right? But also it needs to get to people. Part of the frustration is we've been hearing conversations about mitigation, adaptation, resilience strategies, and consistently told that implementation and scaling is impossible. So we spent the time to find the sites to allow for deployment with trusted leaders. So we're working with faith groups. We have the sites available.
And the projects that are bankable for investors to come in?
Bankable projects, and your first customers is faith groups.
So why are the investors coming? Or
I'm here to talk to all of you. And the key thing here is making sure that we don't see this as charity. These are investable, bankable projects at scale that need to reach people. And it's not just about water, but yes, water, it's about energy. But those are two catalytic functions that enable economic growth, and that's where the Team Europe approach comes in terms of manufacturing, technology, agriculture, etc.
Can I just come in and say that as the investment community, we hear you, but I'm not sure that everyone in the development community cares to hear you. And I think that's the problem. When you talk about a lack of bankable projects, we are the largest institutional asset owners. Every company that's developed a green hydrogen project is in our portfolio. Every company that's developed renewable energy portfolios, projects are in our portfolio. The problem is the procurement system. We can align very specifically in Africa, which is what we're saying to a number of governments as well as the UNFCCC. Africa has $3 trillion worth of NDC potential investment needs and projects. None of those projects can be originated by the private sector. It's become a business for consultants and everyone else to write long reports and do workshops, whereas we can sit down with the government tomorrow and negotiate an institutional investor public partnership that says, which green hydrogen projects do you need? Which renewable energy projects do you need? How can we work out a better investment structure and strategy for you? And we can have the expertise that's even prepared to take the project development risk. So it's really, I think we should really focus on this point. The system is what is blocking private sector participation at scale and the mobilization of private capital. It is not that the investment community do not want to participate. And I think that's lost on too many of us when the development indicators, the investment and the financing gap keeps growing. And there's this echo chamber that says, that private sector don't want to come in, we're only interested in profit, when actually our view is not only do we want to green our portfolios, but we want to green our portfolios so that they decarbonize the real economy. And when we look at just transition and adaptation and these types of things, we take a view on ESG. And we have a saying which is essentially E is the NPV of S. So you don't focus on investing in the environment while people starve and people have no livelihoods. So for us, we're very focused on climate and sustainable development has to be aligned with ambitious industrial growth. And there's a $10 trillion and growing global green industrial economy, which Africa is less than 1% of, yet we hold over 20 to 30% of all the critical minerals. We sort of see ourselves in the continent as the largest global donor because we export a lot of our value, and that is the system, and that is the reform.
But what is wrong in this? Because you mentioned the system is blocking, but what is the part of the system, if one is trying to unblock it? When you say it's blocking, what would you like as an investor?
Yes.
What would you like to see in order to invest in these local community projects for green energy? You have somebody that is looking for an investment, you're an investor. What is blocking you? And perhaps the subsidiary question is, can Europe help also in some instance to unlock this system?
I think we need to create investable asset classes and move away from the episodic project by project bureaucracy. And the Honourable Commissioner made the point. I mean, when we look at climate and mobilizing private capital, I'll be in Berlin in a couple of weeks at the Global Infrastructure Conference. Last year, everyone was lamenting about Fit for 55. The governments are telling us as investors and project developers, this needs to be done by 2030. And then it takes 7 years to get a wind farm permit. So that's the type of anomaly that we're dealing with here, and we need to be able to reconcile that. They say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, the problem is we have a culture that wants to wait 7 years to give a permit and then on the other hand insist that you must do the project yesterday. And I think we need to be able to reconcile those things. There's a philosophical divide between the role of institutional capital in development and the reality of private capital mobilization. And until we address that, and I think the good news is the Global Gateway completely, by its selection of the industries, its geographical comprehensiveness, and its newfound or current role to become a champion in the global green industrial economy. The time is now. And I think Team Africa and Team Europe have an opportunity. But the last thing I'll say on Team Europe is that, we were in Angola in November at the EU Africa Heads of State meeting. Prior to that, we met in Addis Ababa around September for the Africa Climate Summit. We sat down in a round table with European government leaders, with African government leaders, and we said, Team Europe should not just be development finance and governments. It should be development finance institutions, European governments, and the $33 trillion representation of the European institutional investment community. And that is the difference. Otherwise, there's no math that can mobilize or crowd in that capital. And I think those are the simple realities. This is not a complicated issue.
Matthieu, I see you smiling, and you are a European global investor. So what is your take on, first, do you work with institutional investors? Do you find enough bankable projects? And do you also recognize this blockage from the system that prevents from large-scale investments?
So we do work with institutional investors. They're the ones who are providing capital, so the insurance companies, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. And since we're the last panel of the day, I think we can also go towards a message, a positive message of where it works, and looking at, to your point and to your question you were asking, are there enough investable or bankable projects? To some extent, of course, a number of these projects are unlocked, not necessarily for affordability. The affordability is because people are paying a lot for basic services. So the affordability may be there, but they're blocked for a number of reasons. We see our mission as unlocking these projects in a way, as really unlocking them. And so I can give you an example, again, from the water sector. I don't have anything against the others. It's just I've been spending a lot of time on one of these projects, so we get a little bit geeky and obsessive about these things. But for our project in Jordan, of course, you have to build this alignment of stakeholders and you have to unlock the different projects. So you have to build, in a way, a coalition. One of it is on the financial side. So we do have a full blended finance structure. We have donor capital. We have a big group of development finance institutions, including the European ones. All this is allowing us to crowd in private capital, which is the equity which we're investing in there, which is equity coming from insurance pension funds, who are coming on a commercial basis as an investable proposition.
And the reason why this local, sorry for interrupting you, but you also have global, but you also have local pension funds and
also
and
local pension funds as well. This is always an alignment that we try to build, and also global investors. So bringing in both, and bringing in global investors is also important for us because we want. It's a way to achieve scale, and it's also a way to ensure these investments are sustainable, that they're not seen as an expenditure, but as an investment which you can replicate and scale up. And so this is one of the key benefits of this whole blended finance structure and approach, is to be able to do this. But this also means we're not just bringing capital, we're also bringing a know-how and an expertise to unlock these projects. And we don't do this on our own, but we have to lead this process. And again, it's also very much about partnerships. So of course, in the first instance, the partnership with the government, which is very supportive. But also, for example, in the example of our Aqaba Amman project, we're benefiting from the fact that EIB had financed and led an environmental social assessment study a few years ago. So we're not starting from scratch, and that whole timeline is accelerated by that. So it's very much about how we can kind of build these coalitions and with players, and I think this is what Global Gateway is about. And once you have that right alignment, you can actually unlock these projects and deliver them.
But at the same time, at the European level, we hear a lot of European financiers saying that it is risky to invest in Africa and that there is perhaps not enough support to accompany them to do some of their investments. So, and you know, I was mentioning in my introductory remarks also this notion that at the European level there is also a greater focus on win-win. So what is good for the partners, but also what is good for us. If we think from the European perspective, how to bring in better the European financiers as well, and could there be some development of asset class and portfolio type of approaches? Because investors are quite often those we talk to, and I'm sure there are many also in the room, are saying they can work with the EIB or with development financiers, but they find that to go on their own, it is quite onerous, quite difficult, and on project by project, the transaction costs are too high. What are your experience at Meridiam on trying to do that, and what would be your advice to both the European system to try to accompany and to the European financiers?
What we've seen and what we've been able to deliver in a number of sectors and countries is, in a way, unlocking the first projects, or a series of projects, whether 2 or 3 hospitals, 2 or 3 solar farms in a country, and in a way showing the way starting from the ground, from the bottom up. And once you've done that, you've in a way created a bit of an ecosystem with showing the way, by showing what an investable structure can look like, also in a way bringing capacity on the ground, but also in the advisory groups who are kind of supporting these projects, and also in the supply chain, showing for contractors what it takes to actually deliver these projects and helping them understand and access these markets and building local capacity. So in a way we'll do perhaps a few Pathfinder projects, and then the local market and also other global players will kind of continue developing the pipeline. And so we're creating our own competition, but that's also one of the benefits that we're creating, is creating a supply chain. So we have many examples of having done the first projects in a country, and then there's a whole pipeline that follows.
Can I just jump in there, sir?
Perhaps just, if you allow me, I just would like to go to Madam Commissioner. Because you mentioned, Madam Commissioner, that there was also, you encountered also some of these challenges working at the European level. So are there some lessons in trying to attract financiers to address the water resilience, since that was your example, at the European level, that you find was successful within Europe and that could help also in the engagement at the international level?
First, I would like to say, yes, it's not only water. I'm also as obsessed with you in water, and I think for many good reasons. But I mean, also investing in nature, in the soil, is also important, not only for, again, back to Europe, but also for the world. So I think here. So, yes, I mean, if I go to the water resilience strategy, we put forward a water accelerator platform. I mean, because we also need to gather access to capital in Europe. And, in Europe we have a lot of capital, but sometimes it's very stuck. It doesn't really move. We need to. So there's another colleague of mine, Marie-Louise Albuquerque, who's working with trying to focus on getting the bank, saving and bank union, getting it to work, so to say. So that is one thing that is important, and of course that will have beneficial also for other things. So, but back to the water. I meet a lot of water companies who say that, of course, their interest is, of course, to sell a lot, but not only in Europe. But going back to the desalination plants, of course, it's the same techniques in Cyprus or in Jordan or in Africa. So, of course, it's a big. It's a joint way forward, and that is what I think. I'm very happy when you say it's opportunity here. That is, of course, something that European companies could gather from. So, yes and no, there are things to learn from Europe, but also I think also we can learn from others. So I think that is the main thing. But we are working together to find new solutions also on the private capital, because back to Europe, and we know the gap of investments, whether it's water, whether it's nature, whether it's climate adaptation. It's huge, and of course we need to put public money in this, but it will never ever be enough. So we also need the private capital. And here, of course, we are looking into new solutions like nature credits, working with the EIB on different solutions, and other developing banks.
Thank you. Hubert, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, I worry that we're just overcomplicating all of this. The best architects of asset classes, it's not a development finance institution and a multilateral sort of political body. Venture capital was established by an asset owner. Infrastructure was established by Canadian pension funds. Responsible investment as a multi-trillion-dollar asset class was established by Norwegian asset owners. I think you need to see the institutional investment community as a very strong partner in being able to develop these asset classes, because I don't think that asset owners could come in and design development products. That's your expertise. And I think as we're all trying to save the planet and see nature as a globally competitive investable asset class, which is increasingly becoming because of the global ecosystem services that it generates and delivers on a widespread basis, I think the partnership with the institutional investment community, I think if you had Norges and a number of the other asset owners coming and working with the Commission, coming and working with the European Investment Bank, as opposed to the European Investment Bank trying to figure out how do we de-risk, you only get a very small part of the market. And to your point, there is a perception of risk. And I raised this question yesterday.
You mentioned that yesterday, yeah, exactly.
I raised the question yesterday. I've been raising it for 10 years, which is the European Investment Bank hosts the Global Emerging Markets database. That database has been proven, and we've been asking for access to that data as the institutional investment community so we can properly assess the risk, so that we can potentially increase or adjust our allocations to emerging markets and developing countries. Each year, that database is not being shared. It's costing emerging market and developing country governments $15.6 billion each year on excess interest on loans. But it's not being democratized. The G20 heads of state insisted and mandated the GEMS consortium to democratize access to that data for investors, risk takers, credit rating agencies, and there's now research which basically shows that over the last 2 decades, for the global institutional portfolios, because we haven't had access to that data, we've been overpricing emerging markets risk and we've been underallocating. That backtesting data showed that $6 trillion has been wiped off of global institutional portfolios for the lack of access to that data. Now, democratizing access to that data is a costless exercise. It costs nothing. With technology today, that could be done in 1 month, and the lawyers could very quickly figure out all of the confidentiality arrangements around that data. And, it's a costless exercise, and it's not being done. And it has priceless impact if it is, because it reduces the borrowing costs and it unlocks this private capital at scale because it addresses the perception of risk. So I think what the World Trade Organization Director General said yesterday, we need trust. And because that database is not being shared, there's a grave, growing lack of trust, which erodes the ability for governments and private sector to endear towards the global gateway, because we think if you can't do that, if you can't do something that's costless, that will help us save money, grow and develop and become more competitive, then what's the point of putting $300 billion on the table that is difficult to get access to?
And I think you got the answer yesterday that they're working on it in at
10 years.
The EIB. But I'm not trying here to defend the EIB. I'm just saying for those who were not listening to the answer yesterday that was given to you, that they are working on trying to make it more transparent. Brishani, you wanted to react very briefly, and then we will also go to Georgia, and then we'll go to the questions.
I've been trying to hold myself to my seat and avoid jumping up and down a lot. When we talk about simplicity, it reminds me of a conversation that I had in the Eastern Cape in South Africa with a community after doing a big conversation around investment for a due diligence exercise. And a lady came to me who's a farmer and a mother, and said to me, I didn't quite understand the whole conversation, but after you guys do what you want to do, will I be able to buy school shoes and soap? I just want you to think about that for a moment. She's a consumer who's spending money, who's invested in a farm, and all of this conversation doesn't mean anything to her. So when we're making these decisions, taking into consideration what Mr. Danso said about recalibrate your notion of risk, but also understand that when we want to really simplify, then you do what my brother Matthieu said, go and actually start the investments, right? So for simplicity needs to be simple. We can't keep on adding to. If you want to make investments to ensure ecosystem services, provide the clean energy, sun, wind, hydro, right? We don't need to prove these models anymore. We all have the science. But to enable it, start the investments. And I will acknowledge, to your point about the EIB, having people like me in the room is a huge start. I have spent my time being able to bring the stories. My stories are not my stories. My stories are of those women across the continent that are consumers, that are wanting investment to enable trade with Europe.
Yes, and it seems that indeed there are in many developing countries absolutely huge potential for consumption. So from the outside, it seems that it would be a no-brainer to try to stimulate investment in such region. George, these are the kind of conversations you have been involved quite a lot in general. What can be done to try to facilitate also, including on these alignments of local actors, to try to facilitate external investments?
One of the most important things I think would be important, and very often we overlook that because we tend to talk about the speed meter on the spending, is to focus on demand. So what are we trying to fix? Who are we serving? We are serving those in need. And that's why it's very important that all these conversations are based on the need that is provided to those that can't get it through a normal market. Because I guess that what the discussion today on Global Gateway, or any discussion that is about concessional finance or with some kind of purpose, is based on the assumption that there are contexts that won't get the access to the finance. And access
this is what we're seeing in practice.
Without an intent. And that's why I think it's really important to ask developing countries, what do you need? And what's your strategy? Rather than defining how much are we providing on finance. Let me give you one example. Sierra Leone. It's a good example on Global Gateway. Sierra Leone have 6% of their population in rural areas with access to electricity, and 36% of the population with access to electricity. Global Gateway, the EU asked us, UNOPS, to partner in the development of mini-grids, microgrids powered by solar. It's concrete. And it's something that is driven by Sierra Leone. It was Sierra Leone saying, I need this. It was Sierra Leone designing the project. It was Sierra Leone that then came to the EU and said, can you finance? And then the EU brought us to do the implementation. And this is very important, that we don't pretend that it's the supply to frame the demand. It's the demand that frames the supply. And I'm sorry that very often I think that we are overlooking this.
That's true. But with the SDGs, we also know that the needs are huge and that we are not meeting the SDGs, and we are, missing them by trillions of dollars. So this is this notion of, putting just the needs are super important, but the question is how to respond with the investments that can come to try to respond to these needs, but probably the notions of what is it for the local investors, what is it for the international investors, to make it bankable so that these needs will be able to be met by also private finance and not only by public. I guess that's the notions of what we're trying to get. We have just a few minutes left. If there are some questions in the audience. Yes, please. Just wait for the microphone.
Ignacio Corlasoli from CAF, Latin American Development Bank, Latin American Caribbean Development Bank. I want to go a question into, I think Hubert mentioned a lot. I mean, we work a lot on Global Gateway, a lot with the EIB colleagues as well, and other European IFIs. But I want to know more about instruments. That's something that hasn't been in detail made in this discussion. And Hubert, you mentioned it. But what kind of instrument would you see in the Global Gateway? Financial instruments, of course. And of course, I mean, I missed Latin America and the Caribbean in the conversation.
what kind of, if I understood you correctly, you're asking me what type of instruments have we seen within the global gateway?
Mobilise investment.
New financial instruments.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think the first thing is to set the table and create the platform, which is essentially creating the asset class. Once you've created an asset class, you then create an industry of fund managers and all sorts of market-driven instrument origination and design. And I think that's yet to happen. I think we heard from the European insurance industry yesterday, and they described, which I don't fully disagree with, they described the global gateway as a great vision, but it actually hasn't quite boiled down itself and proven which instruments are going to be the most effective for it to accomplish its objective. I think it stays within the sort of the classical institutional allocation related, debt, equity, and all these different instruments that can fit within the profile of what we have a fiduciary mandate to be able to invest in. But I think we should have that humility where institutional investors do not pretend that we can do development finance, and perhaps development finance shouldn't pretend that it can do institutional mobilization, but yet we partner together. And I think the Global Gateway is an excellent platform. To me, Global Gateway becomes unavoidable when it partners with the European institutional investment community to do exactly what you're talking, design products, to have mobilization strategies and create the de-risking instruments and the credit enhancements that can help Europe become a global force, because the reality is Africa does not sit at the table. Europe will not sit at the table without the Global Gateway. And we need Team Africa and Team Europe to ensure that we're not on the menu. And I think that is the plea here. That's where we really need to be able to come together and co-design these instruments. Thank you.
Matthieu, yeah, that's a nice call, by the way, to think, and I think that's in the spirit of the win-win partnerships of the actors, not Europe providing solutions for Africa or for Latin America, but to work with the local actors. Matthieu?
One of the interesting things we found about Global Gateway is there's less focus on the instruments, recognizing a number of the instruments are there already and can be activated, and more focus on really what are the outcomes that we want to achieve, focusing on some of these outcomes, aligning all the stakeholders in there with the existing stakeholders with the instruments, whether development or donors, etc., but also investors and private sector. So really deliberately and intentionally bring in the private sector and really aligning all those around these outcomes. And I think this is where this element of prioritization, intentionality, and direction is really pushing everyone in the same direction. And if you take all the instruments and all the stakeholders, public and private sector, development finance community, and align them around some key objectives, then you can really achieve pretty impressive things in that scale.
Any last comment by any of the panelists? We have 30 seconds left, so...
We've made it easy. We have a $3 billion portfolio across several countries where you have a safe partner in the Catholic Church that's wanting to work across religious groups. We have a portfolio approach. We've got initial projects. We're taking an ecosystem services approach. What's stopping you? Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Madam Commissioner, the last words.
No, thank you very much for a very interesting for a panel and listening to all. I would say I see opportunities here, and that is a big thing for all of us. I mean, we didn't mention the word bioeconomy, but I wrote it down when someone you said something. So I think here's creating growth, creating security, creating resilience in the same time. So I just think that taking this opportunity and go to action, of course, is the most important thing.
Well, that's fantastic. We end up this very stimulating discussion on a positive note on the fact that there are opportunities we can work together. And in fact, Global Gateway is not something static. It's something that is supposed to build on the dynamics of the partner countries. And it's something that is evolving, so we can be hopeful. Thank you very much for the EIB for giving us this opportunity to have this discussion. Thank you.